ESPN MLS ExtraTime is a football game that was developed and published by Konami back in 2001 for the PlayStation 2, with later ports of the game being added to both the Nintendo GameCube and Xbox a year later. This would also be the last game in the series to be released under Konami, as the rights were later sold to EA and the FIFA series. While the PS2 version got generally favourable reviews, both the GameCube and Xbox versions received average reviews at best from various magazines and articles, but that doesn't take away from the overall quality of the game. Essentially what this is just another version of your typical Pro Evolution Soccer games that were also seen on the PlayStation, just using the MLS league stats and pretty much brand. Although from having played it, it plays like one of the earlier PES games, more like the very first Pro Evolution Soccer game that was on the PS1 that was released roughly around the same time as this. As it wasn't as refined, it was still a very good game in its own right from having spent time playing it. It plays exactly like PES games, but I just found it to be not as easily adaptable and refinable compared to the control systems seen in the PES games for whatever reason. Again, it would have been a different development team, I'd imagine, that would have worked on this game compared to the crowd that would have worked on any of the PES games. So there will be subtle differences in terms of the control systems, because essentially the game itself uses the same graphics engine seen in the earlier PES titles on the PS2. There's no real difference in that in terms of its visual quality, as it does play really well. It's just the control system wouldn't have been as simple to use, and it wouldn't have been as sleek compared to the earlier games, as I mentioned. But generally with this game, essentially it's just a rebadged Pro Evolution Soccer in all respects to it. The one major difference is the fact is that it's based on the MLS league in America, where you play as loads of different league teams from that country or region, with current stats and player specifics that were relevant to the time back in 2001. And it is a fairly decent game to play. Like I mentioned, it plays very, very like any of the typical PES games of the early days of the PS2. And if you've played any of them, you'll be pretty much right at home here. Like a lot of the PES games, because they're a lot more simulation focused, it will take a little bit of time just to get familiar with the controls. But once you do, you will be able to have a great experience. And they are among some of the best soccer games ever created, and especially on the PS2, and this one is no different. But is it worth playing in all respects? Well, like I mentioned, if you are a fan of the PES games, it is worth a look, just for the experience of the MLS statistics and setup, and to see a different variety of teams and players, if that's more of your thing. But essentially, if you've played one type of game, you have pretty much played them all. That's the funny thing with a lot of soccer games, and I found that more so as I've been exploring many of these games on the PS2. A lot of them, regardless of the company, whether it's EA, Konami, or even other development companies, even like so with the This Is Football franchise, again it was called other names, or World Tour Soccer in the North American region also. A lot of the games, they're essentially the same, they're just rebranded with different titles just for different regions. So even though there's multiple different versions of the game, they're just technically they're all the same. So if you have played one, you've pretty much played them all. And even for myself going back, now I did gain access and did buy quite a few football games back in the day. Now I would have been more of a PES player more so than FIFA. Now I do like FIFA games, I always did enjoy them, but I always adapted more to the PES type of games. But I found there was only a handful of the games that I would actually go out of my way to buy, because again, I wouldn't buy them every single year, because once you've pretty much bought one, there is a few adjustments and refinements, yes, with each version. But I found a lot of the times with most versions of the games, in my own personal opinion, I always found that like every second version or every second year was always a better version. For example, like with PES 1 was a good game, but PES 2 came out and it was a far better game. It was easier to pick up and play, it was far easier to control, and all round it was just a really good game. It was closer to more of the earlier ISS Pro games seen on the original PlayStation 1. That's what it felt like. Then PES 3 came out, and although it was a really good game, it wasn't as easy to pick up and play. It felt a bit more clunky. Now you could still get into it and play it, and it was really enjoyable, but again, it was just not as refined, or didn't feel as easy to play as PES 2. Then PES 4 came out, and again that was like PES 2. It was much easier to play and more adaptable. Then PES 5 came out, and again the same thing with PES 3. It was a bit more clunkier, and it just didn't feel the same as other PES games. And then PES 6 came out, and it was one of the best ones on the PS2. So I think that was just the whole dynamic of a lot of these games. as they were trying to utilise different gameplay features and they were trying to tweak things with each iteration of the game. In some cases, majority of them worked, while others didn't work so well. Even though they had new features, they just weren't as refined or didn't feel as well put together compared to even older versions of the games. So essentially what usually would have led to most players, even for myself, you would not buy the new game every single year. You'd buy one, maybe hold on to it for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then you'd buy another version, because you didn't really need the newest version unless you were looking for the most updated stats with all the players going to their relevant teams at that time. Other than that, you didn't really need it, because once you were used to the game and you enjoyed playing it with your mates, which is essentially the way I used to play these games, and that was the way I got the most fun out of them. So you didn't really need to go out of your way or spend or waste money buying the whole latest library or the newest version of the game, because you would have just as much fun with the older version that you already had. And that was the thing, like I mentioned, like with a lot of the soccer games that were coming out at the time, even with new versions like whatever 2004, 2005, 2006 at the time, technically in other regions they were the same games, just rebranded. And even with other iterations, you'd always see kind of similar features, and this game is really no different. It's not to say that it's a bad game, it's not a bad game at all. If anything, it's actually a fantastic football game. It just wouldn't be as well refined or polished compared to like the PES games, in my opinion, from having spent years playing them. But it's still a really good title that I do recommend that you try out, and especially if you're in the American region and you don't have access to any of the PES style games, this is a really good alternative. Again, it runs off the same game engine, it has all the same kind of characteristics and features, and you will get used to it and you will have a lot of fun with it, and it is a good game to play with your mates. So I highly recommend that you do check it out. You will actually have a lot of fun with it, plus you'll score some fantastic goals along the way, which is definitely well worth it in all respects. So I highly recommend that you check out this game if you haven't done so already, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well if you haven't played it, or even if you have, and see what you think of it in general. So be sure to share it down in the comments below, and if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be updated of future videos. And in the meantime, if you would like to see more soccer games that were also released on the PS2 that even have similar features similar to this, then check out the playlist here on screen to see more of those football games in action. And as always, I will see you in the next one.